Acyclovir is an antiviral drug that is used to treat herpes simplex virus and the varicella zoster virus. In this mnemonic video, you will learn the mechanism of acyclovir and two closely related medications, their clinical uses, and side effect profiles. Time for lunch at the local recycling plant. And we can see an employee here already chowing down ferociously. Yep, you can tell that this is a recycling plant by that big recycling symbol on the wall and all of those cans and bottles coming down the chute there. Actually, this recycling is a great anchor for acyclovir, the topic of this video. Get it? Because to recycle sure sounds a lot like acyclovir, right? Just remember that this is an acyclovir recycling plant to nail down the association. This recycling is also a great way to remember two other closely related drugs that also end in cyclovir: famiciclovir and valacyclovir. With me on that? One more thing. You've probably noticed valacyclovir really just sounds like a modification of acyclovir. Well, that's a great way to remind you that valacyclovir is just a modified form of acyclovir, which has better oral bioavailability, leading to better efficiency when it is taken orally. Okay, now that we've learned the drug names we need to know, let's learn how they work. Looks like our worker here has a nice smorgasbord of different foods on the table. He seems to really be chowing down into that fusilli there. I mean, just look at that broken piece of fusilli on the end of his fork. You know, the broken fusilli can help you remember that acyclovir inhibits viral DNA polymerase. Get it? Because fusilli sure looks a lot like the double helix of DNA. And the piece of broken fusilli should remind you of the broken, incomplete DNA that you would expect if DNA polymerase is inhibited. Technically, acyclovir is a guanosine analog, or a mimic that looks like the building blocks of DNA, that works instead to inhibit viral DNA polymerase. You see, when acyclovir is substituted for guanosine into viral DNA, it causes DNA chain termination because it lacks the functional group of the polymerase enzymes that it needs to continue adding more nucleotides to continue the chain. You got that? So just remember this broken piece of fusilli pasta to remember that acyclovir inhibits viral DNA polymerase. While we were all surprised at the food selection here at the lunch table, the worker on his lunch break is looking with surprise at something else. A fox has snuck into the recycling plant and is stealing a bottle off the conveyor belt. You know how foxes are, these pests that are always trying to steal food. Well, that fox there is our recurring symbol for phosphorylation, or foxphorylation, if you will. This is to remind you that acyclovir requires phosphorylation for activation. Acyclovir must be phosphorylated by viral kinases, specifically thymidine kinases, before it can work to block viral DNA polymerase. Just like any nucleoside, acyclovir must have 3 phosphates added to it in order to be incorporated into DNA. However, the first phosphate group must be added by viral thymidine kinase before it can fully be converted into the triphosphate form suitable for DNA integration. So, the viral kinases must be present to activate acyclovir with a phosphate group. Got that? What's particularly nice is that the enzyme that adds this phosphate group is specifically made by the viruses that acyclovir targets, which we'll talk about in a moment. This is a nice time to tell you that if a virus becomes resistant to acyclovir, it has most likely mutated its viral thymidine kinase, so that it no longer is capable of phosphorylating or activating acyclovir. This means no phosphorylation and no activation of acyclovir. Smart viruses, huh? Speaking of these viruses, let's move on to cover the clinical uses of acyclovir. Okay, I thought I recognized this worker somewhere. I thought Homer Simpson worked at a nuclear power facility, but I guess he must have gotten laid off and is now working at the recycling plant. At least his eating habits haven't changed. Anyways, the Simpsons are our recurring symbol for simplex, as in herpes simplex viruses, or HSV. Got that? Because Simpson and simplex sound alike, right? And we didn't want to symbolize herpes, since there's a ton of other herpes viruses that you need to know for test day. The simplex bit is a lot more unique for HSV. Anyway, acyclovir is the first-line therapy for all active HSV infections, including both HSV1 and HSV2. This includes oral and genital herpes lesions, as well as more severe infections like HSV encephalitis. As a side note, you might have heard that herpes simplex is forever. And this remains the case, even with acyclovir use, since the drug can only treat active infection. It cannot kill latent or dormant viruses. Anyways, let's move on to learn more about the other virus that acyclovir can treat. Homer has always been good at multitasking, at least when it comes to eating. Fork in one hand and chopsticks in the other. That's actually pretty good chopstick form as he picks up those long, thin, white vermicelli noodles from his bowl and points over to the fox in surprise. Hold on. Those vermicelli noodles there should remind you of varicella, as in varicella zoster. Got it? Because varicella and vermicelli sure sound alike. Just imagine that those are varicella noodles there. Tasty. Anyway, these vermicelli noodles can help you remember that acyclovir helps to treat varicella zoster virus, or VZV. Acyclovir is used to treat both severe chickenpox and shingles, especially in immunocompromised patients who cannot fight off the virus on their own. One more note before we move on to side effects. While acyclovir can treat HSV and VZV, the drug has negligible or no activity against Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV, and cytomegalovirus, or CMV. This is because EBV and CMV make up different thymidine kinases, so they cannot phosphorylate or activate acyclovir. There's other drugs for these viruses. Check out our other videos on ganacyclovir to learn more. All right, now let's talk about side effects. Looks like Homer has already ripped into his dessert, even though he hasn't finished his entrees. Color me surprised, but it looks like his jelly bean dessert is now falling on the ground as he bumps into the table in shock when he notices the fox. Those falling kidney-shaped jelly beans should clue you in that acyclovir can be toxic to the kidneys. You know, since jelly beans are shaped like kidneys, so falling kidney-shaped jelly beans should remind you of failing kidney function, right? Acyclovir can precipitate into a crystal in the tubules of the kidney, which can cause obstruction and renal failure. Remember to keep your patients well hydrated to minimize the risk of this crystal formation. You got that? Okay, that's all I have for acyclovir. Let's summarize what we've learned. Acyclovir and the closely related drugs famiciclovir and valacyclovir are guanosine analogs that are used as antiviral drugs. They work by inhibiting viral DNA polymerase, preventing the synthesis of viral DNA. Importantly, acyclovir must be activated by phosphorylation, which is performed by viral kinases. These drugs are used to treat herpes simplex viruses, or HSV, as well as varicella zoster virus, or VZV. The major side effect to look out for is kidney toxicity. Well, I'm off to call the exterminator to deal with this fox infestation. So I'll see you in the next one.